In the heart of Texas, where the wind carries whispers of forgotten battles and the earth holds secrets darker than midnight, there lived a woman whose truth would shake the very foundations of two worlds. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and for 3 years she had carried a burden heavier than the chains that once bound her wrists. The Comanche warriors who sat in the sacred circle that October evening had heard many confessions, witnessed countless pleas for mercy, and judged the fate of enemies and friends alike. But nothing, not the screams of dying soldiers, not the tears of captured settlers, not the blood-soaked testimonies of war, had prepared them for what would spill from Sarah's trembling lips, as the firelight danced across weathered faces painted with the colors of war, as the drums fell silent, and even the night creatures seemed to hold their breath. Sarah opened her mouth and spoke words that would transform a moment of judgment into a catalyst for vengeance, so pure, so righteous, that the very spirits of their ancestors would rise to witness what came next. What she revealed that night wasn't just her story. It was the story of every woman who had suffered in silence, every mother whose children had been stolen, every soul who had been used and discarded like broken tools. And when the last word left her lips, when the terrible truth hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, the silence that followed was not empty. It was pregnant with the promise of justice. Sarah Mitchell had not always been a broken woman. 3 years ago, she had been the daughter of a prosperous ranch owner, with skin like porcelain and dreams bigger than the Texas sky. She had worn fine dresses imported from back east, attended church every Sunday, and believed with the innocent certainty of youth that God protected the righteous and punished the wicked. That was before Colonel Marcus Whitmore arrived at Fort Davidson with his cavalry unit, before his cold gray eyes had settled on her like a hawk spotting prey, before she learned that evil could wear a uniform and speak with the voice of authority. Now, as she stumbled through the scrubland with her infant son clutched to her chest, Sarah barely resembled the girl she had once been. Her once golden hair hung in greasy tangles around a face carved hollow by suffering. Her dress, the same blue calico she had worn the day Whitmore first visited her father's ranch, was torn and stained with blood that was sometimes hers, sometimes the baby's, and sometimes from sources she tried not to remember. The child in her arms was barely 8 months old, but his eyes held an intelligence that seemed ancient. He had his father's sharp features and the same cruel set to his mouth even in sleep. Sarah loved him with a mother's fierce devotion, but she could not look at him without seeing the man who had destroyed her life. 3 days ago, she had finally found the courage to escape from the fort, where Whitmore had kept her as his personal prisoner. Hidden away in the commander's quarters, like a shameful secret, she had waited until he left on patrol, then slipped away with nothing but the clothes on her back and the baby she refused to abandon. She knew he would come after her. Men like Marcus Whitmore did not let their possessions walk away. The Texas landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of brown grass and thorny mesquite trees that offered little shelter from the burning sun or the cold desert nights. Sarah had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and the monster who had claimed ownership of her body and soul. Her feet, wrapped in cloth torn from her petticoat, were bleeding through the makeshift shoes. Each step sent daggers of pain up her legs, but she forced herself to keep walking. The baby needed milk, needed shelter, needed safety. And somewhere out here in this vast wilderness, there had to be someone who would listen to her story and believe her. She had tried to tell people before. When Whitmore first began his visits to her father's ranch, she had confided in her mother about the way he looked at her, the inappropriate comments he made when her father was out of earshot. But her mother had hushed her, reminding her that Colonel Whitmore was an important man, a hero of the Indian Wars, and that a girl should be flattered by his attention. When Whitmore had asked for her hand in marriage, Sarah had begged her father to refuse. She had told him that something about the colonel frightened her, that his touch made her skin crawl, that she would rather die an old maid than become his wife. But her father had already made his decision. The colonel's offer was too generous to refuse, and besides, what did a 17-year-old girl know about choosing a husband? The wedding had been a beautiful affair, attended by half the county and presided over by the territorial governor himself. Sarah had worn her grandmother's white silk gown and carried a bouquet of wildflowers from the ranch. In the photographs taken that day, she looked like a princess from a fairy tale, radiant and hopeful. But if you looked closely at her eyes, you could see the fear lurking just beneath the surface. The honeymoon had been her first taste of hell. Whitmore had taken her to a hotel in San Antonio, where he had spent 3 days methodically breaking her spirit. He had not been content simply to claim her body. He had needed to own her completely, to reduce her from a person to a possession. He had used his fists when words were not enough, his belt when his fists were insufficient, and methods that she still could not bear to remember when even violence failed to achieve the complete submission he demanded. When they returned to Fort Davidson, Sarah was a different person. The bright-spirited girl who had dreamed of traveling the world and writing novels had been replaced by a hollow-eyed wraith who spoke only when spoken to and never raised her gaze above the level of her husband's boots. But Whitmore was not finished with her yet. He had explained his grand plan during one of their first nights in the commander's quarters, while Sarah lay bleeding on the rough woolen blankets of their marriage bed. He was not just building a military career, he had told her. He was building a dynasty. The Western Territories were filling up with settlers, and soon there would be statehood, political opportunities, chances for a man with vision to become something greater than a mere army colonel. But for that, he needed sons. Strong, intelligent sons who would carry on his name and his ambitions. Sarah was not his wife in any meaningful sense. She was a broodmare, carefully selected for her bloodline and her ability to produce the heirs he required. The first pregnancy had ended in miscarriage during her 4th month, brought on by one of Whitmore's rages when she had dared to speak to another officer without his permission. He had beaten her so severely that she had lost consciousness, and when she woke up 2 days later, the child was gone. She had wept for that lost baby, grieved for the life that would never be, but part of her had also felt relief. At least her child would never have to grow up in this house of horrors, would never have to call Marcus Whitmore father. But Whitmore had not shared her grief. The loss of his potential heir had only made him more determined, more cruel. He had locked her in the quarters, allowed her no visitors, no letters, no contact with the outside world. She became a ghost, haunting her own life, visible only to the man who owned her, and the handful of servants who brought her meals and tried not to meet her eyes. The second pregnancy had been successful, if that word could be applied to anything connected to Marcus Whitmore. For 9 months, Sarah had carried his child while he monitored her every breath, controlled every bite of food she ate, documented every change in her condition like a scientist studying a laboratory specimen. When her labor began, he had sent for the fort's doctor, but he had also remained in the room throughout the ordeal, watching with those cold grey eyes as Sarah screamed and bled and brought his son into the world. The first words the baby had heard were not gentle words of welcome, but Whitmore's harsh voice declaring that the child looked strong enough to survive. Sarah had hoped that motherhood might soften her husband, might awaken some spark of humanity in his frozen heart. Instead, it had only made him worse. The baby was his heir, his legacy, and Sarah was merely the vessel that had delivered his prize. She was allowed to nurse the child, to care for his basic needs, but every aspect of his upbringing was subject to Whitmore's approval. The colonel had already begun making plans for his son's education, his military training, his eventual commission in the army. He spoke of the boy as if he were a weapon being forged, a tool to be shaped and sharpened for future use. And when Sarah had tried to object, had suggested that perhaps their son might want to choose his own path in life, Whitmore had reminded her, with his fists, that she was not entitled to opinions about the boy's future. That was when Sarah had begun planning her escape. It had taken months of careful preparation, of pretending to be the broken, submissive woman Whitmore believed he had created. She had memorized the patrol schedules, noted which guards could be trusted, and which reported everything back to the colonel. She had hoarded scraps of food, hidden away what little money she could find, and waited for the perfect opportunity. That opportunity had come 3 days ago, when Whitmore had ridden out with a full company to investigate reports of Apache raiders near the Mexican border. The patrol was expected to be gone for at least a week, perhaps longer if they encountered trouble. It was the longest Sarah had ever been alone since her marriage, and she knew it might be her only chance. She had left in the early hours of the morning, before sunrise, carrying nothing but the baby and the few supplies she had managed to gather. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond getting as far away from Fort Davidson as her legs could carry her. Freedom was a concept so foreign to her after 3 years of captivity that she barely knew what to do with it. Now, as the sun climbed higher and her water ran lower, Sarah began to understand that escape was only the beginning of her troubles. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and she was a city girl who knew nothing about surviving in the wilderness. The baby was growing fussier, sensing her distress, and her milk was starting to dry up from dehydration and stress. But even as her situation grew more desperate, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in years: hope. For the first time since her wedding day, she was making her own choices, walking her own path. If she died out here in the desert, At least she would die as a free woman rather than as Marcus Whitmore's property. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to notice signs that she was not alone in this wilderness. There were tracks in the sandy soil, hoof prints from unshod horses, and occasionally she spotted smoke rising from hidden campfires in the distance. This was Comanche territory, she realized with a mixture of fear and strange relief. The Comanche were enemies of the white settlers, certainly, but they were also enemies of the U.S. Army, and that made them, in a twisted way, her allies. The enemy of her enemy, as her father used to say. Sarah knew the stories that were told about the Comanche, tales of scalping and torture and captivity worse than death, but she also knew that most of those stories came from men like her husband, men who used fear as a weapon to justify their own cruelties. She had lived with a monster for 3 years, had experienced horrors that would make the devil himself blush. How much worse could the Comanche be? As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded her of blood and fire, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. Instead of hiding from the signs of Comanche presence, she would seek them out. She would find these warriors and throw herself on their mercy. And perhaps, if she was very lucky and very brave, she would finally find someone willing to listen to her story and believe that even a broken woman deserved justice. The baby stirred in her arms, opening his dark eyes to stare up at her with an expression that seemed far too knowing for such a small face. Sarah smoothed his hair, so like his father's, but still innocent of his father's sins, and whispered a promise that she intended to keep. "I'm going to make sure you never become the man he wanted you to be," she said softly, "no matter what it costs me." In the distance, a coyote howled, and Sarah Mitchell walked on into the gathering darkness, carrying her son toward an uncertain fate and the slim hope of redemption. The Comanche hunting party found Sarah at dawn on her 4th day in the wilderness. She had collapsed near a dry creek bed, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion and dehydration, her baby crying weakly in her arms. When the shadow of the lead rider fell across her face, she looked up through cracked lips and swollen eyes, and felt not fear, but relief. The warrior who dismounted to examine her was a man of perhaps 40 winters, his face marked with the traditional scars of his rank, and his long black hair decorated with feathers earned in battle. His name was Soaring Eagle, though Sarah would not learn this until much later. His dark eyes took in her condition with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen much suffering in his life. Behind him, 5 other warriors sat motionless on their horses, their faces painted with white and red clay, their weapons ready but not raised. They spoke among themselves in their native tongue, words that flowed like music despite the harsh circumstances. Sarah caught none of the meaning, but she heard something in their voices that she had not heard from men in a very long time: respect. They were debating what to do with her, she realized. A white woman with a baby, alone in the desert, obviously fleeing from something. In the stories told around army campfires, this would be the moment when the savages would scalp her and steal her child. But these men seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare, discussing her situation with the gravity of elders considering a difficult judgment. Finally, Soaring Eagle knelt beside her and offered her water from a leather pouch. The liquid was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the sweetest thing Sarah had ever experienced. She drank greedily, then held the baby to her breast, grateful when her milk began to flow again. The warrior spoke to her in broken English, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You hurt? Sick?" Sarah shook her head, though the movement sent waves of dizziness through her skull. "Tired," she managed to whisper. "Hungry. But not hurt." "You run from something," he observed. It was not a question. Sarah nodded, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. For 3 years, no one had shown her this kind of basic human kindness. No one had asked about her welfare without expecting something in return. Soaring Eagle exchanged glances with his companions, then made a decision that would ripple through both their lives in ways he could not foresee. He gathered Sarah in his strong arms, lifting her as easily as he might lift a child, and placed her on his horse. Baby was secured in a sling across her chest, and then they were riding through the desert toward the Comanche encampment. The village was unlike anything Sarah had expected. Instead of the savage war camp described in army reports, she found a thriving community of families living in carefully organized teepees, children playing games in the dust, women working with leather and beads while they gossiped and laughed. Dogs ran between the dwellings, and horses grazed in a makeshift corral, watched over by young boys learning the responsibilities of manhood. The arrival of a white woman caused a sensation, But not the hostile reaction Sarah had feared. People emerged from their homes to stare at her, but their expressions showed curiosity rather than hatred. Some of the older women clicked their tongues sympathetically when they saw her condition, recognizing the signs of abuse even across the barriers of culture and language. Sarah was taken to the teepee of Medicine Wolf, an elderly woman whose weathered face spoke of decades of healing and wisdom. Without a word, the old woman began tending to Sarah's injuries, washing her wounds with herb-infused water and applying healing salves to her blistered feet. She examined the baby with the expertise of someone who had delivered hundreds of children, pronouncing him healthy despite his ordeal. Over the following days, as Sarah's strength slowly returned, she began to understand the complex society she had stumbled into. The Comanche were not the mindless savages of army propaganda. They were a sophisticated people with their own laws, customs, and moral code. They valued courage, honesty, and loyalty above all else, and they treated their women and children with a respect that Sarah had never experienced in white society. Gradually, as her health improved and she began to pick up fragments of the Comanche language, Sarah's story began to emerge. It came out in pieces, told to Medicine Wolf during the long afternoon hours when the old woman worked on her healing crafts. The story of her marriage, her captivity, her husband's brutality, and her desperate escape painted a picture that resonated deeply with the Comanche understanding of justice and honor. Medicine Wolf was a woman who had lived through the destruction of her own family by army soldiers, who had seen her husband and oldest son killed in a raid on a peaceful winter camp. She understood the capacity for evil that could hide behind a uniform and a flag. But even she was shocked by the systematic cruelty that Sarah described, the calculated breaking of a woman's spirit for the sole purpose of producing children. The old woman shared Sarah's story with the tribal elders, who listened with growing anger and disgust. Among the Comanche, women were valued partners, not property. A man who treated his wife as Marcus Whitmore had treated Sarah would face severe punishment, possibly even exile from the tribe. The idea that this was considered normal behavior among white soldiers filled them with righteous fury. But there was a problem. Sarah's presence in the village was causing controversy among some of the younger warriors. She was white, the wife of an army officer, potentially a spy or a source of information that could lead soldiers to their hidden camp. Some argued that she should be killed to protect the tribe, while others insisted that she should be ransomed back to the army for supplies and weapons. The debate raged for days, with passionate arguments on all sides. Sarah, understanding enough of the language by now to follow the general discussion, waited with growing dread for the decision that would determine her fate and that of her child. Finally, Chief Running Bear, the leader of this band of Comanche, made a decision. Sarah would be brought before the Sacred Circle, the most solemn gathering of warriors and elders, where she would have the opportunity to speak for herself. If she told the truth and proved herself worthy of their protection, she would be welcomed into the tribe. If she lied or proved herself to be an enemy, she would face the consequences. The Sacred Circle was formed at sunset, with 40 of the tribe's most respected members arranged in a perfect ring around a ceremonial fire. The flames danced high into the darkening sky, casting flickering shadows on painted faces and revealing the glint of weapons and sacred ornaments. This was a place where truth was sacred and lies were deadly, where the spirits of ancestors were believed to watch over the proceedings and guide the decisions of the living. Sarah stood in the center of the circle, holding her baby close to her chest, feeling the weight of 40 pairs of eyes examining her soul. She had never been more frightened in her life, but she had also never been more determined to speak her truth. Chief Running Bear, a man of enormous dignity, whose scarred face spoke of countless battles, gestured for her to begin. His voice when he spoke carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "White woman," he said in careful English, "you come to us broken, seeking shelter. Before we decide your fate, you must speak truth. Tell us your story and do not lie to the spirits who watch over this circle." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the baby's warm weight against her chest like a talisman of courage. This was her moment, her chance to finally tell someone the complete truth about her ordeal. She thought of all the times she had tried to speak and been silenced, all the pleas that had been ignored, all the suffering that had been dismissed as a woman's natural lot. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. 3 years ago, I was forced to marry Colonel Marcus Whitmore of the United States Army. I thought I was becoming a wife. Instead, I became a prisoner. The words came slowly at first, then faster as the dam of her silence finally burst. She told them about the wedding that had been more like a sale, about the honeymoon that had been an education in cruelty, about the months and years of systematic abuse that had followed. She spoke of being locked away from the world, of being treated like an animal bred for a specific purpose, of watching her spirit break piece by piece under her husband's relentless campaign of degradation. The Comanche warriors listened in stunned silence as Sarah described horrors that challenged their understanding of human behavior. Even men who had seen the worst brutalities of war found themselves struggling to comprehend the methodical evil she described. This was not the heat of battle violence they understood, but something far more disturbing: the calculated destruction of another human being's soul. When Sarah spoke of her husband's plan to create a dynasty, to breed sons who would carry on his legacy of cruelty and ambition, several warriors made sounds of disgust. Among the Comanche, children were treasures to be nurtured and guided, not weapons to be forged. The idea of treating one's own offspring as tools for personal advancement was repugnant to their deepest values. But it was when Sarah spoke of her pregnancy and the birth of her son that the mood in the circle shifted from disgust to something far more dangerous. She described how Whitmore had treated her during those 9 months, monitoring her like a prize mare, controlling every aspect of her existence to ensure the production of a healthy heir. She spoke of giving birth while her husband watched with clinical detachment, of nursing her child under the constant supervision of a man who saw the baby as property rather than a person. And then Sarah spoke the words that would seal Marcus Whitmore's fate. "He did not marry me for love or even for companionship," she said, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. "He used me to bear his offspring. I was not a wife to him. I was a breeding animal, kept in captivity for one purpose only. He broke my body, crushed my spirit, and stole 3 years of my life so that he could have sons to carry on his name and his evil." The silence that followed these words was profound and terrible. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, as if the flames themselves were shocked by what they had heard. The baby in Sarah's arms stirred restlessly, sensing the tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Soaring Eagle was the first to speak, his voice thick with rage, barely held in check. "This man, this colonel, he still lives?" Sarah nodded. "He is searching for me now. He will never stop looking, because he considers me and the child his property. In his mind, we belong to him like his horses or his weapons." Chief Running Bear rose slowly, his aged joints creaking with the movement. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "You have spoken truth to this circle," he said. "The spirits confirm your words, and your courage honors our ancestors. You and your child are under our protection now. But more than that, you have revealed to us an evil that cannot be allowed to exist in this world." He turned to address the full circle, switching to the Comanche language for a proclamation that Sarah sensed was of enormous importance. The warriors began to nod and grunt their agreement, their painted faces hard with purpose. When Running Bear had finished speaking, he looked back at Sarah with eyes that held the promise of justice. "We will find this Colonel Whitmore," he said. "We will show him what happens to men who treat women as animals, who break the sacred bond between husband and wife. We will teach him the meaning of fear before we send his spirit to face the judgment of the ancestors." Sarah felt something break inside her chest, but this time it was not her spirit cracking under the weight of despair. It was the chains of helplessness that had bound her for 3 years, finally snapping under the force of other people's righteous anger. For the first time since her wedding day, she was not alone in her suffering. For the first time in her adult life, someone was willing to stand up for her and demand justice on her behalf. As the sacred circle dissolved and the warriors began making plans for war, Sarah clutched her baby close and allowed herself to believe in something she had thought lost forever: the possibility that evil could be defeated and innocence could be protected. The hunt for Marcus Whitmore was about to begin, and Sarah Mitchell had just become the most dangerous woman in the territory. She had found her voice at last, and her words had awakened something in these fierce warriors that would not rest until justice was served. Marcus Whitmore returned to Fort Davidson 7 days after Sarah's escape, his patrol dust-covered and empty-handed from their unsuccessful hunt for Apache raiders. The first sign that something was wrong came when he noticed the unusual quiet in the garrison, the way soldiers avoided meeting his eyes, the nervous tension that seemed to permeate the very air of the fort. The second sign was Sergeant Murphy waiting for him outside the commander's quarters, the man's usually ruddy face pale as parchment and his hands trembling slightly as he saluted. "Colonel, sir," Murphy began, his Irish accent thicker than usual with stress, "I'm afraid I have some disturbing news to report." Whitmore dismounted from his horse with the fluid grace of a career cavalry officer, but his steel-gray eyes had already turned cold with suspicion. In his world, disturbing news usually meant someone had failed to follow his orders precisely, and failures were punished swiftly and severely. "Report," he said curtly. "Not bothering with pleasantries. Your wife, sir, she's gone missing. Disappeared 3 days after you departed on patrol. We've searched the surrounding area, questioned everyone at the fort, but there's no trace of her or the child."
The silence that followed Murphy's words was more terrifying than any shout of rage could have been.
Whitmore's face went through a series of subtle changes, like ice forming over a deep lake, until his expression settled into something that made the sergeant take an involuntary step backward.
"Missing!" Whitmore repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "My wife and son are missing from a United States Army fort, and you're telling me this 3 days after the fact. Sir, we didn't want to interrupt your patrol unless it was absolutely necessary. We thought perhaps she had gone for a walk and gotten lost, or maybe taken shelter somewhere during the storms we had. But when she didn't return by the second day—" "You thought," Whitmore interrupted, each word falling like a hammer blow, "you thought, instead of following standing orders, to report any irregularity immediately to the commanding officer." Murphy's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. That is, no, sir. We should have sent a rider immediately. But, sir, there's more you need to know." Whitmore's eyes narrowed to slits. "More? Some of the men are saying they saw Comanche sign in the area. Horse tracks, unmarked. There's speculation that your wife might have been taken by hostiles, sir." For a moment, something flickered across Whitmore's face that might have been genuine concern. Might even have been fear. But it passed quickly, replaced by the calculating coldness that was his natural state. "Double the guard," he ordered. "Send riders to Fort Stockton and Fort Bliss with descriptions of my wife and child. Offer a reward for information leading to their recovery." "And Sergeant Murphy?" "Yes, sir. If I discover that anyone at this fort could have prevented this situation and failed to act, they will face a court-martial. Is that understood?"
"Perfectly, sir."
But as Murphy hurried away to carry out his orders, Whitmore stood alone in the gathering dusk and allowed his mask of official concern to slip for just a moment. The truth was, he was not worried about Sarah's safety. He was worried about his property walking away without permission, about his carefully laid plans being disrupted by an act of defiance he had not anticipated. Sarah had always been weak, broken, completely under his control. The idea that she might have found the courage to attempt an escape was both infuriating and intriguing. If she had indeed been taken by Comanche, she would likely be dead within days, and the child with her. But if she had run away on her own, if she had somehow summoned the will to defy him after 3 years of perfect submission, then she would need to be taught a lesson that would ensure such defiance never happened again. Over the following days, Whitmore threw the resources of the entire fort into the search for his missing family. Patrols scoured the countryside, tracking parties followed every trail, and riders carried word to every settlement and outpost within 100 miles. He played the part of the concerned husband perfectly, accepting sympathy from his fellow officers and speaking movingly about his fears for his wife and child's safety. But privately, his rage grew with each passing day. Sarah belonged to him. She was his possession, acquired through legal marriage and maintained through careful control. Her escape was not just a personal betrayal. It was theft of his property, rebellion against his authority, an intolerable challenge to his absolute power over his domestic domain. When the first reports began trickling in of increased Comanche activity in the region, Whitmore felt a grim satisfaction. If the savages had taken Sarah, they would provide him with the perfect excuse for the punitive expedition he was already planning. And when he found her, whether she was a captive or a runaway, she would learn what happened to women who forgot their place in the natural order of things. What Whitmore did not know was that the Comanche were no longer simply hiding Sarah, they were hunting him. The war party that Chief Running Bear assembled was unlike any that had ridden from their encampment in living memory. 40 of the tribe's finest warriors, men who had earned their reputations in battles against Mexican troops and American soldiers, mounted on the fastest horses, and armed with weapons that spoke of decades of successful raids. But this was not a raid for horses or supplies. This was a sacred mission, a quest for justice that had been blessed by the tribal elders and sanctified by the spirits of their ancestors. Soaring Eagle had been chosen to lead the war party, a decision that honored both his skill as a warrior and his role in finding Sarah. He rode at the head of the column, his face painted with the symbols of war and vengeance, his mind focused on the task ahead with laser-like intensity. Behind him, the other warriors sang the old songs of battle, calling on their ancestors to guide their weapons and strengthen their resolve. Sarah had provided them with everything they needed to know about Fort Davidson: its layout, its defenses, the habits of its commander, the schedules of its patrols. But more than tactical information, she had given them something far more valuable: a righteous cause. Every warrior in the party had a wife, daughters, sisters. Every man among them understood that what had been done to Sarah could be done to any woman, and that such evil must be stopped before it could spread. The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. They would not attack the fort directly, where Whitmore could hide behind walls and soldiers. Instead, they would draw him out, make him come to them on ground of their choosing. And they had the perfect bait: Sarah herself. Word reached Fort Davidson through a captured Mexican trader that a white woman and child were being held by Comanche at a sacred site known as Crying Woman Canyon, 2 days' ride to the north. The trader spoke of seeing the woman from a distance, describing her appearance in terms that matched Sarah perfectly. The Comanche, he claimed, were demanding ransom for her return: 50 rifles, ammunition, and a dozen horses. Whitmore received this news with barely concealed excitement. Here was his chance to recover his property and punish the savages who had dared to interfere with his affairs. He immediately began organizing a rescue mission, selecting his most trusted men and planning a campaign that would demonstrate once and for all the price of crossing Colonel Marcus Whitmore. He never suspected that the trader was a Comanche sympathizer who had been carefully coached in his story, or that the sacred site where Sarah was supposedly being held was actually a carefully prepared killing ground, where 40 warriors waited in concealment among the rocks and scrub brush. The column that rode out from Fort Davidson 3 days later consisted of 30 cavalry soldiers under Whitmore's personal command. They were well-armed, well-mounted, and supremely confident in their ability to handle any group of savage warriors who might dare to stand against the might of the United States Army. Whitmore had handpicked each man, choosing soldiers known for their loyalty to him personally and their willingness to follow orders without question. As they rode through the desert landscape toward their rendezvous with destiny, Whitmore allowed himself to savor the anticipation of what was to come. He would rescue Sarah, of course, but not before she had learned the consequences of her defiance. The months of captivity among the Comanche would have broken whatever spirit had led her to attempt escape, and her gratitude for her rescue would ensure her complete submission for the remainder of her life. And if the savages chose to resist the return of his property, well, that would simply provide him with the opportunity to demonstrate the superior firepower and discipline of civilized soldiers. Either way, he would return to Fort Davidson with his reputation enhanced and his authority restored. Crying Woman Canyon was a narrow gorge cut through red sandstone by countless years of flash floods and erosion. High walls rose on either side of the canyon floor, creating natural ramparts from which defenders could rain down death on anyone foolish enough to enter the trap. It was here that the Comanche had made their preparations, positioning warriors in concealment among the rocks and brush, checking and rechecking their weapons, preparing for a battle that would be remembered in their stories for generations to come. Sarah waited at the far end of the canyon, no longer the broken woman who had fled into the desert weeks before. She wore Comanche clothing now, buckskin dress and moccasins crafted by Medicine Wolf's skilled hands. Her hair had been braided in the style of the tribe's women, and her skin had been darkened by sun and wind until she could almost pass for one of the people. But it was her eyes that showed the greatest change. Where once there had been defeat and despair, now there burned the flame of righteous anger and iron determination. The baby slept peacefully in a cradleboard on her back, unaware that his fate and that of his mother would be decided in the next few hours. Sarah had sworn an oath before the sacred fire that her son would never grow up to become the monster his father had planned to create. Today, that oath would be tested. When the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, announcing the approach of Whitmore's column, Sarah felt her heart begin to race with anticipation rather than fear. For 3 years, she had lived under the shadow of this man's power, had cowered before his strength, had believed that she was helpless against his will. Now, she would discover whether that power had been real or merely an illusion maintained by her own despair. Soaring Eagle appeared at her side, his presence calm and reassuring. "Are you ready for this, white sister?" he asked, using the name the tribe had given her after her adoption into their family. Sarah nodded, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I have been ready for this moment since the day I married him. I just didn't know it then." The warriors took their positions, 40 men who had become her brothers in arms, her protectors and avengers. They would not all survive the coming battle, Sarah knew, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on her heart. But they had chosen this path willingly, had declared that some evils were worth dying to destroy. As the sound of approaching hooves echoed off the canyon walls, Sarah Mitchell stood straight and proud, no longer a victim, but a woman who had found her strength in the most unlikely place. The broken girl who had fled into the desert was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true freedom was not simply the absence of chains, but the courage to stand and fight when fighting was necessary. The final confrontation between Colonel Marcus Whitmore and the woman he had tried to break was about to begin, and this time Sarah would not be facing her monster alone. In the distance, a war cry echoed off the canyon walls, the sound carrying with it the promise of justice and the hope of redemption. The reckoning had come at last.